My client today earns more than my client earned even a year ago, 8 or 9% more.
That's a lot.
And you're like, well, that's a lot. They must be doing pretty good. No, it's because even at a higher income level, you get into debt now. And so what we've done is we've moved everybody up the curve. I can't prove it, but I suspect that my clients today have a higher credit score than what they had a year or 2 or 5 ago.
That's interesting.
But they're maxed out, right? Like, how do you get a high?
Now, do you think they're maxed out because they're trying to feed that beast being the mortgage, and rates are renewing, and you got to find extra $2,500?
Yep. Yeah, and again, very few of my clients are homeowners, so we haven't got to those people yet. Those are the ones we're going to be talking about next year and the year after. It's people who are just crushed by the cost of living, and
rent being one of them.
Yes. And everything, like everything is more expensive. So for the viewer, I'm not supposed to look at the camera, but I know you're in there. Take a look at the numbers. How much were you making 2, 3, 4 years ago? And how much were you spending on groceries? How much was a liter of gas? How much was everything? And for a lot of people, their income has gone up at a slower pace than expenses. Okay, well, how are you funding that shortfall? Are you cutting back? Are you just only eating every other day? Is that your plan? No, you're probably spending more, and you're probably using debt to bridge that gap, which when interest rates were 0 was fine. No problem. The federal government did it. Everybody did it. But now that interest rates are higher, we've got more debt, which isn't the problem. It's the carrying cost of debt that's the killer.
Yeah.
And that's what's whacking people.
Well, you talked about cost of living and inflation. I want to talk a little bit about that for a minute. I'm a big numbers guy. I really like drilling down on the 8 components that make up the CPI basket. The top 3 being shelter, transportation, and food. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk a little bit about transportation for a minute, because the percentage weighting of that component has ranged from 15.96 to almost 20% within a 4 or 5 year window. Mm-hmm. Now, someone would say, well, Vince, listen, back in 2020, there's a lot of people at home. They weren't driving, so they got to adjust the weighting. Makes sense. But why would the weighting be 20% in 2021 and only 16% now? It should be the opposite. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about inflation figures from month to month going up and down 0.1, sentiment is a big driver in how people behave. And I think these numbers are manipulated to the point where they're trying to create a narrative that really isn't there, because you and I know the cost of living is a lot more than that inflation rate. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you could talk about shelter and housing and interest rates, but everything else is going up. Mm-hmm. And I think you see it every day.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's why I encourage everyone to do their own numbers.
Everybody has a different basket.
That's right. So, like, how much does a pound of bacon cost compared to 2 years ago? And the answer is, it's pretty close to double.
Yep.
So even though food inflation is 23% over the last 3.5 years, that pound of bacon is double. So if you're somebody who likes to eat bacon, and I'm not encouraging people to eat bacon here, let me be very clear about that.
I know Ron does.
Absolutely. As do I, actually. So if that's something you spend your money on, then yeah, absolutely, it's gotten worse. In transportation, you're absolutely right. There are people who've said, you know what, I can't have a car because I simply can't afford it. And if you live in Toronto, you can't afford to park it, let alone drive it. So we've got more and more people who are giving up their cars just because they can't afford it. So what is happening with your own personal inflation? Well, for a lot of people, it's a lot higher. And I totally agree with you on sentiment. It's not what's happening today that matters. It's what do I think is going to happen tomorrow?
Yeah.
And so if I think things are going to get worse, so you mentioned the savings rate went way up during the pandemic, 25%. And the savings rate is the difference between the ins and the outs. That's what the difference is, what we save. It's not, they don't count up how much is in your bank account. It's the difference between the ins and the outs. So why did the savings rate go way up? Well, it's because we didn't have any money to spend it on, couldn't go outside, couldn't go on a vacation. Yeah, okay, that's all true. But it's also because I was really worried about the future. because the world was going to end. It was going to be horrible. And so we better tuck something away. Well, now the savings rate has come back down, not to where it was 5 years ago, but it eventually will hit that number. I'm pretty sure the US is way ahead of us on that metric. So I think the reason the savings rate has come down is I need the money to pay for my living costs and so on. So, and at the same time, credit card debt way up.
On the credit card debt, and going back to the original question about what you saw when you started and what you see today and what people are spending money on, one of the things that is the most impactful, I believe, is the minimum payment that's due on a credit card. When I started lending back in my days at TD and Canada Trust back in the late 80s, early 90s, we always had to use a 5% repayment on credit card balances. Now, in some cases, it's 2%.
Yep.
Some are 1%.
Yep.
And there's really this perpetual debt that continues to accumulate. And at 20% interest rates, it only goes up. It can't come down.
It's massive. Yeah, it's absolutely massive.